A Doll's House. Holly Mazur in conversation with designer Lily Arnold. Holly is sat on a chair to the right, facing Lily on the left. They are both sat on a stage with the auditorium behind them with 3 tiers of seating. Holly is a 30-year-old white woman with medium-length dark brown hair. She is wearing round glasses, a black jumpsuit, bright blue socks with bees on them and black ankle boots. Lily is a white woman in her mid-30s with short blonde hair. She is wearing a black crop jacket, black t-shirt, blue ankle-length trousers and trainers.
Hi, I'm Holly Mazur, the head of drama at Fulham Boys School, and I'm joined by Lily Arnold, the set and costume designer for A Doll's House, which was first performed here at the Lyric Hammersmith in 2019. Hi Lily.
Hello.
So today we're going to talk about how you came up with the set and costume design for A Doll's House. I'm really interested in how you started this process. What parameters were you given which spurred on your first design?
As with pretty much all productions that I take on as designer, the theatre company or the venue/theatre company where the production is being produced will usually give you a sort of parameters or guideline, often as a document to begin with, and then we'll have a meeting about it. Also what the space, the venue that you're going to be designing the show in, and the production manager who sort of oversees the construction and build part of the design. They will provide you with technical drawings of the venue, so you can know exactly kind of where the edges are and how deep the stage is and how tall the space is, whether you need to have access all around the stage in the wings for to allow for a crossover, which is where the actors can kind of pass behind the set. Any other sort of technical things about the space that are going to inform how you design the play. You do what's called a white card model presentation, which is the first time that anyone apart from the director will have seen your design, and it's at that point that the design that you've suggested will be costed by the production manager. So they'll take your white card model, which, as the name suggests, is usually a white card version of it. So you might not have got round to painting it at all or adding textures. It's very much a kind of bare bones of the structure of it. And the production manager will take that and they'll start to figure out how much it's all going to cost. For A Doll's House, the white card was actually, which doesn't always happen, but it was actually quite similar to what the final design was. Because in some ways the design for the show was quite simple because it was one static set, so it didn't have a revolve, it didn't have big bits of moving scenery. So there was kind of not very many denominators. There wasn't that much that you could strip away other than changing the entire design. The expense with this show was that it was of such a big scale, so it filled almost the entire stage. I think we had about 1.5 meters upstage of the back wall of the set, which did allow for actors to pass behind the set unseen by the audience. But other than that, it literally took up the entire kind of stage space, and was made from lots of steel and lots of wood. I think those were the 2 main sort of material ingredients. So it was quite difficult to sort of take any of the bits of it away without, really having to change the whole thing.
Great, and you mentioned that it was quite a pared back, naturalistic set. What was the reason behind going for that?
Well, I think Rachel and I felt like we wanted to give these characters sort of space to breathe. I think also it came from the character Tom refers to Niru a few times during the play as a kind of caged bird, his skylark, I think he calls her, and this idea that she was this, again, as he says, this exotic kind of precious object that was kind of flitting about in this quite concrete feeling, almost prison-like space, that didn't have lots of detail and decoration, that felt kind of over-embellished. because actually it didn't feel to us like it was about those kind of details and embellishments of their life. It was about their relationships, the relationships of the characters, and how they kind of collide and how they navigate around each other in the space, rather than how the spaces control them. And actually Niru's she's the nucleus, she's the kind of the centre point around which everything spins. And so kind of seeing her in this massive space felt like the right kind of way forward, I guess.
We talk sometimes in drama, in terms of set design, of time, atmosphere and location. Obviously this was set in Victorian Calcutta. How much did that influence your set design?
Yeah, I mean, a lot really, although you wouldn't necessarily immediately be able to see that influence, I guess, in a way that you would if we'd done a much more naturalistic version of the play. But I think for me, it's always vital that no matter whether your final design outcome is a kind of Peter Brook white box, that your starting point is what was real at that time and what was really, what did things look like then and what were the people like of that time and what was their sort of social system and what were the politics of the time, and you assemble yourself the sort of known facts of that era. I went to Kew Gardens because I'd come across a thing called a Wardian case, which is basically a kind of mini sort of greenhouse, which I think these days is called a terrarium. But it was basically a thing in Victorian times that people would give to each other with exotic plants in. So if you lived in this country, someone might send you from another country a tropical plant that obviously can't exist in the British climate. So you'd keep it in this little sort of micro ecosystem of its own, like a kind of precious little object. And then I quickly realised that actually there's a lot of symbolic mirroring of how Niru is in the space that she lives in, and how Tom has kind of constructed this kind of glass house around her, and that she's this exotic creature that's existing in a space that she can kind of see out of. She has an understanding of what the world is outside of that space, but she somehow can't access it in the way that she wants to, which is what she realises at the end, that actually she, as much as she on paper has her freedom because Tom allows her to move freely and doesn't make her wear, Western clothes, those things, she actually isn't free. And that's, her realisation at the end, which is why she leaves.
When she leaves, she obviously leaves through the back door, which in Ibsen's original is sort of quite a big moment. How did you go about deciding what that door was going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, it was quite tricky actually, because I can't pinpoint exactly why this is, but I'd felt like that the door that she leaves at the end has to have been unbreached throughout the rest of the story. And also it felt like it needed to be visible and quite central. That's probably also my leaning always towards symmetry, and there's something in that and the power of this kind of portal to the kind of world beyond. It became a little bit tricky because obviously there are comings and goings in the story of the play. So, Dr. Rank enters and Mrs. Lahiri enters sort of at a similar time. And, Rachel and I were kind of like, okay, well, how can we make it make sense that this door isn't breached? And then actually, brilliantly, which happened a few times with this production, we found out that there could have been a version with the kind of courtyard house that we'd set the play in, where they had a side entrance to the property that would have been used by the kind of daily comings and goings of friends and family. And, unless you were a kind of dignitary or someone very senior, you wouldn't have come through that main door anyway. And that door would have just been a kind of presentational front door out onto the street, but not really used, kind of day to day. So suddenly that was like, okay, brilliant. That really helps because it fits in with the rest of the jigsaw that we're trying to put together. And it means that when Neru leaves at the end, she's not only kind of breaching that closed door, kind of moving through that sort of portal, but she's also presenting herself to the world. If we imagine that door literally opens directly onto a street outside, but there's this really kind of both ornate but also heavy obstacle of the door that's preventing her from that kind of free passage. It's kind of like Tom, I guess, a bit, the door. If the tree in the design is sort of Neru and their marriage, then the door is kind of symbolic of Tom sort of standing in front of her, not permitting her to pass.
And I guess if the door in some ways symbolises Tom and the tree symbolises their relationship, something that struck me as being quite symbolic as well in this play was the different uses of levels throughout. I wonder how much that was informed by the culture, the sort of caste system and that kind of thing, or if it was purely status driven.
I remember coming into the theatre on the first day of the fit up, before the set had really been painted, and looking at the level of that veranda sort of balcony and thinking, blimey, that's really high. And thinking, you know, these actors are going to really have to kind of crane their necks to look up to it. And, you know, but we made the decision to have it at that height because we wanted it to have an echo of the auditorium, so that it felt sort of like a fluid extension of the balcony levels in the auditorium. And also that it was high enough that it did feel like when a character was up on that level, they were dominant. They had a very strong position in relation to whoever was, you know, down on the sort of seemingly kind of sunken central section of the veranda, and also to give us a kind of voyeuristic option as well for people to be kind of lingering on the sort of perimeter of a scene. So that our transitions weren't sort of, you know, jump cut or static, but people could appear before they then entered into the scene in a more kind of fluid fashion. Which is also why we had 2 doorways. We had actually 3 doorways on the lower level, and then we had 2 on the upper level, which didn't have doors, they were just openings. And that allowed, again, for the characters to kind of, they could sort of linger in the doorway without stepping into the space. So you couldn't see them coming, which gave us the option then for people to kind of ambush scenes. And that all kind of tied into this feeling of tension and, you know, at any moment, any conversation could be interrupted and people could be overheard. And, you know, someone could have overheard Neru telling Mrs. Lahiri that she'd forged the papers for, you know, or that she'd, you know, procured this money. And you just wouldn't know because they could have just been just out of eye line, just through the door. So that all kind of helped to charge the space, I suppose, with this potential for exposure.
And I think that was enhanced by the fact that there weren't any set changes.
Yeah.
You had lighting used really effectively to take us from one room to another, as it were.
Yeah.
How did you work with the lighting designer to decide that?
So Kevin, the lighting designer, came to the final model showing and saw the 1:25 scale version of the design. He had this idea to rig the lamps, the lights, to a lighting bar as we normally would do, but actually to fly the whole bar with, you know, 10 lamps on up during the show, so that you got this sense of the light moving around sort of across the space, and thereby the sense of time passing and the sun moving over this house. And also through the tree, he did a similar thing so that he could move the shadow around the kind of internal courtyard of the space, which was amazingly effective, actually. So yeah, kind of his lighting design was in some ways very naturalistic, but then he he also chose some lighting states that were slightly more abstract. So I think for one of the moments between Nehru and Mrs. Lahiri, which was blocked as being downstage left, he created a state that was actually quite kind of defined and focused, which, you know, felt in some ways at odds slightly with the naturalistic space around them, but also made sense in relation to where the balconies were. And we did sort of use artistic license in places to suggest that we were in a different space, even though we were physically still in the one space. But I mean, props became very handy for that because we didn't have lots of you know, set decoration, and we didn't have a scene change to go into a physically different environment. We used you know, props like two whiskey glasses and a bottle of whiskey to suggest that we were in Tom's study, or a shrine to suggest that we were in the servants' quarters, or, you know, we very carefully picked those props out that said time and place, so that we could then not have to kind of overpopulate the space around that. So I think is always, you know, the aim really is to distill as much as you can into, for me anyway, fewer objects rather than having lots of stuff.
To what extent would you say that the set is a representation of Nehru's psychological state throughout the play?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said before, with this play specifically, it's all about that. I mean, that is what the story is about, is her transgression. So my challenge was how to have the environment around her reflect that, which we didn't do in a way that was kind of overtly obvious or kind of on the nose. It was quite subtle. And I guess the tree that grew up through from the sort of ground level, from the red tiles that were sort of the centre of the courtyard, all the way up through the space, through the courtyard, and then out through the roof of the set, was the kind of most obvious direct link to Nehru and her state of mind, being that she has sort of spent her time with Tom kind of searching for the light and trying to grow up and out of the life that she lives. And then there was sort of elements like the letterbox, which the letter from Das is posted into, which obviously holds the truth about her having forged these papers and borrowed money. There was a light. We decided, I think Kevin and Rachel decided that it would help with the tension towards the end of the play to illuminate that letter as it dropped into the box. We spent a long time trying to find the right letterbox. And so I think in the end, we ended up finding something that was almost there, but we had to kind of adapt it because we needed it to have a glass front so that when the letter was posted through the letterbox in the door, we could see it then on the inside of the house appear in the letterbox. And it also needed to be lockable so that Tom could be the only person with the key, which, you know, relates to his control and the kind of patriarchal society of the time that, you know, the man of the house would be the only person with access to that sort of communication stream. So yeah, but that light became also part of, I guess, a reflection of her state of mind, that she, as soon as that letter lands, that light goes on and she turns into this very different, very kind of charged being, until it's taken out of that box and the sort of going out of the light is Tom reading it, and then we move into a different chapter of the story.
Could you tell us a bit about the way that you designed the costumes for this play?
Tanika, very early on in the process, I think maybe the first meeting that Rachel and I had with her to talk about design, she mentioned to us a film called Charulata, which is a film made in India in the 60s, I think, but set at the turn of the century, so late Victorian, but I think, yeah, probably about 10, 11 years after A Doll's House is set. It was interesting in this film that the sort of female protagonist was wearing traditional sari, but the blouse that she was wearing underneath her sari had really was very similar to a British Western Victorian blouse shape. The shape of it was very much, a sort of tighter sleeve with lots of kind of frill detail and lace. Some of them were quite high-necked, again with lots of detail, lots of lacing detail on them. And I was really surprised by that because I had seen from other photos of women of the time something quite different, and to find out that actually there was a lot of merging of styles was great, because it also tied into this idea that as much as Tom allows Neeru to wear sari and to wear traditional Indian dress and not make her wear kind of Christian British clothing, there's been a bit of seeping in of that style. And that was kind of helpful to be able to clothe her in that in something that felt kind of in both worlds in a way.
Were there different ways of tying the saris?
Yeah, lots, many, and again dependent on exactly what region you were from, and then also dependent on what social status you were. So the lady of the house would tie her sari differently to a servant. We used a technique that sort of went around the waist and then over the shoulder, so it left a kind of quite a long strip of fabric that was kind of loose. And I think Angela really liked that because it gave her something to hold and to kind of fiddle with. So it wasn't all really neatly tucked in everywhere. There was a section of it that she could kind of have available to her to kind of screw up. And I mean, Angela is the most incredible physical actor. Like, she's always moving, her toes are always tapping and her eyes are always moving, and the same with her hands. Like, she's always acting with everything. And so for her having that bit of fabric that she could manipulate in response to how she was feeling, to communicate the feelings of Neeru, I think was quite useful. And then I looked a lot at colour and how she lived in her setting. The first one was a kind of dusty pink colour, which really kind of sat her nicely in the colours of the set. So she kind of was at one with it. And then the second sari she had was a deeper, more sort of richer red, with the idea being that her will and her resolve to kind of escape her life increased, the vivid, saturated colour increased. And then her final costume had a completely different feel to it, because it was a very pale blue. And a colour that we hadn't really seen before, and a very cold colour, and it sat at odds with the kind of internal environment of the courtyard of her house, which was intentional because she's about to leave, so she's kind of put that on as a first marker of her ambition to escape her life, basically. So that was the sort of colour progression. Whereas with the male characters, Dr. Rank and Tom, both very much conformed to the dress of the time of a British colonial, male of their kind of standing. So they were in off-whites, because I did want to create a bit of a feel like, they're obviously living in this hot country. They're not so wealthy that they can have their clothes laundered all the time. A bit of a feeling that it's hot and it's uncomfortable and they're kind of trussed up, and that's not how they really want to be, but they're also unable to kind of break away from how they should be. They don't have that kind of sense of freedom. Accessories and hair and makeup, how much did that tie in with the costume design? For Anjana playing Neeru, I think she had 4 or 5 different looks with her hair. So we started with it being neater, and by the end it was a much more relaxed kind of down look. And then we also fed in, some research that I'd done of ways in which women of her kind of status and place in society would have worn their hair in relation to the servants, or in relation to Mrs. Lahiri, who's a widow, so she wouldn't have necessarily had loads of embellishments. And then the same with the men. That came slightly more from research and, looking up all the different varieties of Victorian beard styles, but then also feeding in what the climate was like. And, it's likely that they wouldn't have had massive, heavy beards because it was just too hot. And then, so you're kind of feeding in historical context, and then you're also feeding in character context. So as much as Tom might have had a big beard and very well kept hair, his character doesn't necessarily befit that. So we went for a kind of slightly longer hair for him, that suggests that he, does look after himself, like he's not completely wild, but also he doesn't come across as a very kind of slick back, buttoned up person. He's kind of somewhere in between.